All right. Good evening and welcome everyone to the Muskoka Libraries virtual author event with award-winning novelist, playwright, and screenwriter Emma Donoghue. We are so excited to have you all here this evening, especially Emma. Tonight, Emma will be discussing her latest novel, The Pull of the Stars, published in July of this year by HarperCollins. My name is Julia Reinhart. I'm the CEO Chief Librarian of the Gravenhurst Public Library, and I'm starting things off tonight. To begin this event, I would like to read the Land Acknowledgement Statement. As our commitment to the Truth and Reconciliation Promise and Process, I begin this event by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, especially the Chippewa and Ojibwe peoples. We recognize the historic and present contributions to our province and country of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. We as Canadians are all treaty people. As I mentioned in my introduction, this event is a collaboration by the public libraries in Muskoka. Lake of Bay's CEO Chief Librarian, Kathy Fairburn, shared the idea with the group initially. I think it's a great example of how well libraries do work together, especially during challenging times, such as these, as we adapt our activities to bring special events like this one to all of you in a virtual format. We miss being able to host author events in our library spaces and are grateful for this opportunity, made possible through Emma Donoghue and her publicist, Lauren Morocco at HarperCollins. Before I introduce you to our moderator, I have a couple of housekeeping items. Near the end of tonight's discussion, there will be time for Emma to take a few questions from the audience. These can be posted by using your chat feature through the Zoom webinar. This event is also being recorded and will be posted on social media by the hosting libraries. Now I'd like to introduce you to Nina McCreath, who is going to be acting as moderator for tonight's event. Nina, who co-founded the Flying Dragon Bookshop in Toronto, has a lot of experience facilitating book clubs, interviewing authors, and writing book reviews. As a book club discussion facilitator, her goal is to provide an enhanced level of enrichment for participants with lively discussion, and she will be doing just that this evening. So now I'd like to turn things over to Nina.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's very exciting event. We are pleased to have award-winning author Emma Donoghue joining us to talk about her book, The Pull of the Stars. Emma was born in Dublin, Ireland. In her early school years, she attended a Catholic convent school in Dublin. She went on to earn her BA in English and French at University College Dublin. She moved to England and received her PhD on the concept of friendship between men and women in 18th century English fiction. Wow. At the University of Cambridge. From the age of 23, Emma has earned her living as a writer. After years of commuting between England, Ireland, and Canada, in 1998, she settled in London, Ontario, where she lives with her partner and their 2 children. The Pull of the Stars is set in 1918 Dublin, taking place over 3 days in a maternity ward at the height of the Great Flu. A small world of work, risk, death, and unlooked-for love. In an Ireland doubly ravaged by war and disease, Nurse Julia Power works at an understaffed hospital in the city centre, where expectant mothers who have come down with the terrible new flu are quarantined together. Into Julia's regimented world step 2 outsiders, Dr. Kathleen Lynn, on the run from the police, and a young volunteer, Bridie Sweeney. In the darkness and intensity of this tiny ward over 3 days, these women change each other's lives in unexpected ways. They lose patients to this baffling pandemic, but they also shepherd new life into a fearful world. With tireless tenderness and humanity, carers and mothers alike somehow do their impossible work. In the pull of the stars, Emma Donoghue once again finds the light in the darkness in this new classic of hope and survival against all odds. Welcome, Emma. We are delighted to meet you and talk with you about the pull of the stars. Now, if you would like to read a passage right now, we'd be delighted to hear it.
Sure. Thank you, Nina. Thanks, Julia, and everyone in the everyone who's made this event happen. I've never lived up in Muskoka, but I have been on many a holiday, especially to Bondi Resort. So I think of it as one of my happy places to go mentally in times like these. And in fact, I was up there in June. So yeah, I'm very happy to be doing this event. And yes, I'm going to read you just 3 pages from The Pull of the Stars, seen here in its lovely HarperCollins edition. By the way, this book was not only written long before COVID, but it was meant to be published long after. It was meant to come out next year. But my publishers rang me up in March and said, it's about a pandemic, let's bring it out in July. And I honestly didn't know that they could work that fast. So I can't believe they made such a beautiful job of it. And at first I felt a bit sheepish publishing anything this year when so many writers have been, had their books postponed. But then I realized it would give me a chance to go on and on about how wonderful doctors and nurses and midwives are all year. So I'm glad this book has been part of the COVID conversation, Anyway, here's a little bit from the very start of the book where Julia Power is on the tram to work it's Halloween 1918 in Dublin. On a fence, specifics of a variety concert with cancelled stamped diagonally across them. An advertisement for the All-Ireland hurling finals, postponed for the duration, pasted on it. So many shops shuttered now due to staff being laid low by the grippe, and offices with blinds drawn down or regretful notices nailed up. Many of the firms that were still open looked deserted to me, on the verge of failing for lack of custom. Dublin was a great mouth, holed with missing teeth. A waft of eucalyptus. The man to my left on the tram bench was pressing a soaked handkerchief over his nose and mouth. Some wore eucalyptus on their scarves or coats these days. I used to like that woody fragrance before it came to mean fear. Not that I had any reason to shrink from a stranger's sneeze, being immune now to this season's awful strain of flu. There was a certain relief to having had my dose already. A man's explosive cough on the bench behind me, and then another hack, hack, a tree being axed with too small a blade. The mass of bodies leaned away from him. That ambiguous sound could be the start of the flu or a convalescent's lingering symptom. It could signify the harmless common cold or be a nervous tic, caught like a yawn just by thinking about it. But at the moment, this whole city was inclined to assume the worst, and no wonder. 3 hearses in a row outside an undertaker's, the horses already in harness for this morning's first burials. 2 aproned men shouldered a load of pale planks down the lane to the back for building more coffins, I realized. The street lamps were dimming now as day came. The tram rattled past an overloaded motor launch that looked tilted, askew. I saw 2 men kick at the rear axle. A dozen passengers in mourning wear still sat pressed together on its benches, as if stubbornness might get them to their funeral mass on time. But the driver, despairing, let her forehead rest on the steering wheel. The man sitting jammed against my right elbow trained a little torch on his newspaper. I never had a paper in the house anymore for fear of upsetting my brother. Some mornings I brought a book to read, but last week the library had recalled them all for quarantine. Could leave that there.
Thank you very much, Emma. It's a beautiful book. Your writing is really wonderful.
Thank you.
So you wrote the book in 2018. What a strange coincidence that you submitted the novel just when our own COVID-19 pandemic was being identified. And in your book, you have a number of passages that are so eerily similar to what was going on in the world at the time that our pandemic just started. I'm going to read you just a few lines from time when Julia, that we've just talked about, has stepped off that tram and she's just about to go into the hospital where she's about to start her shift in the ward. And she's observing about the pandemic and what her thoughts are. She says, this flu was clogging the whole works of the hospital. Not just the hospital, I reminded myself, the whole of Dublin, the whole country. As far as I could tell, the whole world was a machine grinding to a halt. Was it a little bit freaky for you that so much of your book is actually echoing what's happening over 100 years later?
It was, but it's not that I have any prescience or anything. It's, there have been a number of novels published about the Great Flu over the years or about other flus. So, I'm not unique. And there was a lot of attention paid to it 2 years ago when its centenary was being celebrated. So it was just strange timing that mine happened to be delivered. I delivered the very last draft on the 3rd of March this year. But I suppose the reason our world sounds so strangely like the passage you read is that in both cases, we're talking about a highly industrialized society that runs on clocks, runs with electricity, cars, telephones, trams, trains, even airplanes. Many of the same technologies were being used then and now. So in some ways, a plague would hit our world in quite a similar way to how it hit in 1918. By comparison with, the Great Plague in 17th century London, that was not a regulated society with well-staffed hospitals and tram schedules. That was just everyone flee from the city, and people in, masks stuffed with herbs. So of course, any tale of 1918 is going to sound rather more like COVID. But on the other hand, there are vast differences between them. So much of what I've felt this year in watching the headlines has been not so much like, oh, that's just like my novel, but all these moments where I think, oh, thank God we're not in 1918. Thank God our scientists, they had diagrams of what the coronavirus looked like within days. Back in 1918, they didn't even know what a virus was. So doctors like the real life Kathleen Lynn in my novel, they were doing autopsies on fluids from their patients, and they were peering and peering to try and find the bacterium that they could blame for this. And of course, we now know that viruses are far smaller, and they couldn't have spotted them with the microscopes they had then. So we're in so much better a position science-wise, and even in terms of the speed of our communication than they were in 19. And in 1918, they were so ground down by 4 years of war as well. So in every way, I would say it was worse back then.
Yes, well, it certainly sounds like it was pretty bad, that's for sure. How did you come to be interested in the Spanish flu of 1918?
I have very varied interests. What I really like is variety and novelty. I started my first novel at 19 and I'm 51 now, right? So what's crucial to me is to keep those juices flowing. So I remember once I was on a panel of historical novelists, and my fellow novelists scolded me for not doing at least a trilogy set in, say, 18th century London. She said, why do you waste all your research by moving on to something else? I said to her, I would get bored. I'm not looking to maximize my output here. I'm looking to keep the juices flowing. So I frequently get drawn to a time and place and subject I've never written about. I would say in this novel, there are certain preoccupations of mine you can see, like my novel, The Wonder in 2016, that was about a nurse as well, a Victorian nurse. And you could say that I've written things set in confined quarters before, most famously in Broome. So this novel has certain things in common with some of mine, but I've never set one in early 20th century Ireland, and this one has an unusual focus not only on the pandemic but specifically specifically on birth during the pandemic. Because the little fact that hooked me in my researches back in October 2018 was that women in late pregnancy were the most likely to catch this terrible flu and the most likely to have terrible side effects from it. And I thought, oh, that's irresistible. I'm a lifelong fan of Grey's Anatomy. There's nothing like some medical oddity overlapping with life crisis. So having these women trying to give birth, doing something so normal, but in the middle of an absolutely abnormal pandemic, which was likely to medically complicate their births, I just thought, I can't resist the kind of double drama for each patient of this.
Well, interesting that the ward that Julia works in is in fact a maternity ward and a flu ward, thinking that they needed to put these two together to keep the flu out of the maternity ward as much as possible, but also look after these women while they were actually about to give birth or giving birth even, especially in the case of the book, many of them they didn't get up to the maternity ward, it was too late. Um, but I You're a writer of many genres, and a number of your books are historical fiction. What draws you to writing about historical fiction? In a way, it's almost like you're collapsing history and bringing history to the present, not just factually, but emotionally as well. I wanted to read a quote from Doris Lessing in her biography. She said, "There is no doubt fiction makes a better job of the truth." What are your thoughts on that?
Well, certainly a lot of my historical fiction has been explicitly revisionist. I began doing by doing a PhD in Cambridge on 18th century fiction, and I got very interested in everything that was sort of left out of the records. The women novelists popular at the time who'd been completely forgotten since. The uncomfortable facts, such as the existence of slaves in 18th century Britain, that hadn't really made it into the official sense of what 18th century Britain was like. So I got very interested in the nobodies and the outsiders and those who've been left out. And I've written a lot of fiction which is specifically based on real people, but real people about whom we are unlikely to ever learn the full truth. So I suppose if I'd been interested in a different subject, I might have become a historian, but because I was so interested in the women and the minorities and the oddities, in a way, fiction seemed the form that would bring them to life best. But also in terms of looking for subjects for fiction, the past offers many very flavorful locations, and often the stakes were very high in the past. If you go back before lovely things like the welfare state or, government payments to encourage people to stay home safely during a pandemic. If you go back a bit, the stakes are high because if you stay home, you starve. If you make one mistake, you end up literally in the gutter. So the past offers a lot of high drama in that way. I also love getting away from our modern mindset and going back before the same assumptions were generally agreed. So, you go way back before it was agreed that women had souls, or that people of all colors were equally worthwhile. And then you can see these new ideas like, say, democracy or human rights just beginning to emerge. So it's always a wonderful sort of defamiliarization device to go way back before the labels. Again, I've written a lot about sexuality, and I find it really interesting to go back to a time when people didn't have labels that they would check on a list. They were just sort of experiencing their feelings in all their shocking novelty without having easy terms for them. So history offers me so much. I think of it as a bit of a an attic full of treasure. And I like the kind of challenge, I suppose, of trying to sum up the mindset and the flavor of each era and bring my readers there.
It must be difficult to distill all that information and all the research into the book that you want to write. Do you get to a point where you think, okay, I've got it. This is what I want. This is the full circle of what I'd like to write about. Is it a difficult
It's
process?
more that you have to be very strict with yourself. You're reading the early drafts and you're saying, that's just a footnote, Emma. You put it in somebody's mouth, but it's really just a footnote, isn't it? Like with this book, say, I had vast amounts of medical information, but I had to say to myself, it's only relevant if it comes up. Like if one of Julia's patients is dying of, say, there's a blood transfusion that goes wrong because the woman has a bad response to the blood, the so-called universal donor blood. This happened to a friend of mine. She was being given the universal blood, didn't work for her. She had a terrible response to it.
Yeah.
So I put, by the way, one of my childbirths and childbirths of several friends of mine into this book. It's a kind of a compilation of all the things that can go dramatically wrong in childbirth. So yeah, if something like that comes up, then Julia needs to know about it, needs to talk about it, needs to consult the doctor on it. But she can't be just making general chat about medical issues. It has to come up. Or again, if Kathleen Lynn is mentioning some fact like that the Germans at the time cremated their dead, and the English would have seen this as a horrifying, barbaric act, but the doctor is thinking, well, hygiene-wise, it was a very sensible thing to do. So she has a reason to mention it. She's in the middle of an autopsy with Julia, and she, to her, it seems highly relevant to talk about what we do with dead bodies during a pandemic. So the rule has to be that there's a good reason for it to come up. Otherwise, cut it out.
Well, you certainly managed to seamlessly and smoothly insert so many interesting facts into the book. I mean, one of them is that Julia's turning 30, and with the suffrage at the time, you could vote when you were 30, but you had to prove that you had land ownership. What a funny combination of things. And how many women actually could prove that? Such an interesting fact.
That's right. When they decided to let women, as well as they were letting lots of younger men vote. Basically, when the soldiers came home, the idea was, whoops, if we don't give them a vote, they might riot. So let's let all the men over 21 vote, whether they have money or not. And then they thought, oh, okay, we could give the vote to women at the same time. But so many men had died in the war. The fear was, if you let women vote, suddenly you'll have a voting population which is 2/3 female. Impossible. So they said, okay, we have to make a quota. It's like when they first let Jewish people into a club or something, they would literally assign a quota. So same with the women. That was the only reason. It wasn't that they thought young women were immature or that women who didn't have property would be bad voters. It was just there were too many of us. So yeah, about 10 years later, they finally then let all women vote. But yes, I thought it would be, I decided to make Julia be turning 30 because of that very fact. I was like, oh, if she was 30 that month, she could vote. Okay, I'll have her just on the verge of turning 30.
So interesting.
And one reason I decided to give her a birthday was that I wanted there to be a little bit of delicious food somewhere in the book, because my novels set in Ireland in the past typically have hideous food. I'm just trying to be accurate. So there's a lot of watery turnips going on. And especially during World War, at the tail end, when they were starting to bring in rationing at the end of World War I knew the food would be downright nasty. They had this thing called war bread, for instance, very whole wheaty with bits and pieces of oat and bread in there. Everybody hated the stuff. And the rule was you had to let it go stale for 12 hours before selling it in case people would eat too much of it. So in that context, I thought there needs to be a moment when Julia and Bridie have something delicious to eat. So I thought, okay, Julia's brother can give her an orange from Italy and a couple of truffles, chocolates, for her birthday. So again, that was the reason for the birthday.
Well, and that orange and those truffles, honestly, we could almost taste them as a reader, especially in contrast to all the other colorless food that
yes,
have been
the
mentioned.
Context of turnip.
Yeah. I wanted to talk to you about your settings. So the ward, you do seem to like to write about small settings. The ward is a tight, very controlled environment. And it's such a personal environment for the reader to enjoy. I feel as though as a reader, I was sitting on a very top of a cupboard and I was looking down into the ward.
Yes, because there'd be no room for you to sit down. It's not like there are armchairs for you. I agree. You have to be high on the wall because there's no floor space.
So just perching on the top of the cupboard would be all I could do. But you really get a sense of the rush and the blood and the sorrow on the part of the patients, and Julia's never-ending tasking. The fact that she has something to do every moment, and there are a few moments of quiet and grace amongst that, but not very many. And you feel how tired she is. It's you almost are writing it in real time. It's a very personal, upfront way for the reader to experience it. We are in the room with Julia and the patients, especially their beds are close together, and but you also have a scene where Julia and Bridie are on the roof of the hospital, and it's another beautiful, evocative scene. There's a sky above them. It's a beautiful night. The stars are twinkling. It's a wide open vista and a wide open scene in such contrast to the ward. Why did you choose to have two such diametrically opposite scenes? They both work so well, and you really breathe the fresh air that they breathe when they come out onto the roof. It's beautiful. But how did you come to write those two opposite scenes?
I don't think about my readers demographically. I don't, because my books are so different. Some of them appeal more to younger people, some more to older people, and so on. So I don't think of my readers like, oh, typically 65 and living on Ontario. I never count them that way, but I think a lot about my readers in terms of what they're going through. For instance, in The Pull of the Stars, I deliberately make very long chapters. It's literally to give you that feeling of the shift going on and on. There are no easy breaks. So I think a lot about my readers' energy levels and when they'll need a little respite and when they need things to be, made clear to them, that people can live in suspense up to a certain point, but then they sort of made they need things clarified. And moments of sweetness to relieve the tension. I remember, for instance, when I was writing Room, that I often wanted to tinker with the balance. I wrote the basic draft very easily, but then I spent a lot of time just tinkering with that balance between light and dark. So I think about my readers' sort of emotional needs. And I knew that with The Pull of the Stars, and especially before the last chapter, we needed a respite, we needed a rest. And above all, Julia and Bridie needed somewhere to talk that was out of the ward, because the ward is such a pressure cooker. As you say, I've written a lot about kind of situations of confinement. And I think that's because I'm very interested in women's history, and women's lives have often been too small. They've often been too indoors. You know, I've been in, say, Greek villages where you think the women have all died of a mysterious plague, but no, it's that they're at home making the dinner, and it's the men you see out in the public spaces. So,
Yeah.
you know, writing about people shut in rooms, that's very representative of a lot of women's lives, especially before the 20th century. So,
Yeah.
so yes, I knew I wanted something as a contrast with that. And because I had my title, The Pull of the Stars, which it means influenza, basically. Influenza comes from the phrase, the influence of the stars. It was a medieval Italian belief that the stars were literally giving us this illness by sort of tugging on us. So I thought, okay, I want some actual stars in my book. And maybe if they went up on the roof to see them, that would give us all a bit of a break from the ward. I also thought of the rhythm of the book in terms of childbirth, you know, I think childbirth, well, my experience of it anyway, was that it's doable because it comes and goes, the pain, it's contractions. I suppose a runner might have a similar philosophy about, you know, the highs and lows of running. But I think if any pain is just absolutely constant, it would be almost impossible to deal with. But the way you have a wave of pain and then a wave of relief. So I almost thought of putting my readers through that as well. You know, like how much can they take? And, you know, if there's been one death, then I will make the next thing to happen be a birth. So, you know, I'm not entirely merciless, is what I'm saying. I may put my readers through a lot, but I do think a lot about what they can take and what's going to motivate them to keep going and to stay committed to these people.
That rhythm that you put into the book, I mean, that's what makes you such a great writer, because subliminally we feel that, and it works so beautifully. So the concept, getting back to the meaning of the book, influenza, and the idea that fate just determines whether you're going to be getting the flu, and may just also determine the whole pathway of your life. You, in contrast to taking charge of your own destiny and making things happen and pushing against the fate that you might be going down the road of, you open up this concept of fate versus taking the reins of your own life with your characters. You have Julia, who is a real rule follower. She doesn't smoke or drink because it's not allowed to as a nurse, even on her own time. She doesn't dare do that. And she can't arrive at the hospital sweaty because matron would disapprove. So she rides her bike part of the way and then takes the tram so she can appear composed when she arrives at the hospital. You know, she is quite intent on doing what she's supposed to do. And then you have Dr. Kathleen Lynn, who is a person from history, from the world, and I'd like to ask you why you chose her. But she is determined to change up to the trajectory of Ireland, and she's not accepting the status quo as it is. And then Bridie, the sunshine of the book, her life has been completely prescribed. She has been following along in a very narrow path that has been prescribed to her from the beginning. So this idea of fate versus taking your own destiny is a very interesting one in the book. And how do you feel the characters represent those themes?
Well, what's interesting is that none of them would be entirely clear about which they believe in. Dr. Kathleen Lynn was Protestant. The other two are Catholic, but they're not the kind of Catholics who simply believe, oh, everything's meant to be. Whereas there are some in the book, such as the nuns, who, if a baby dies, they're like, oh, God wanted a little angel. But for Bridie, who's had such a hideous upbringing in orphanages and basically institutional homes, and even for Julia, it's a lot more puzzling than that. And of course, Julia's quite scientific, so she can see, for instance, that her poorer patients from the slums, they are meeting this pandemic already damaged. They have the pre-existing conditions of poverty. You know, one of her patients comes along to give birth with one of her legs already hugely swollen up from the last time she gave birth. So these bodies are damaged already. And one of the things that politicizes Julia in the book is watching so many of her patients suffer and be unable to find any more strength in themselves to fight the pandemic with. And Julia starts to really resent the fact that, say, government posters are so sort of tin-eared on this subject. You know, there'll be a government poster saying, when you feel a symptom, lie down and have yourself nursed for 2 weeks, you know, and seek out sunshine and fresh air. And she'll find herself thinking, these people live in slums, cheek by jowl, you know, how on earth are they meant to seek out sunshine and fresh air in a Dublin November, you know, and who's meant to be nursing them for 2 weeks? So she gets in a way politicized by watching her patients suffer, as well as from Dr. Lynn's more, you know, specific sort of political teaching, because Dr. Lynn is an Irish revolutionary. She was the chief medical officer of Sinn Féin. She'd been involved in the 1916 Rising. And to answer your question, I was not looking to include any real historical people in this book, because I've done that in many other books, and it's wonderful, but it's an additional complication. So in this case, I already had a massive pandemic to include, which there were so many, you know, real medical facts I had to be accurate about, and the war and so on. So I wasn't looking for historical people, but I just wanted background information on Irish doctors of the time, and who should I come across but Kathleen Lynn. And she was so interesting in that she was a highly trained doctor, but because she was a woman, no hospital in Ireland would take her on full time. So she was a, you know, a roving doctor. She had qualifications in midwifery and insanity and ophthalmology. I mean, clearly a Renaissance woman in her interests. She was running her own little flu clinic at this time, funded by the woman she lived with all her life. She was doing autopsies. She was trying out, you know, she was attempting to work out vaccines for the flu. She was just so interesting. And also she was a fully committed political revolutionary who was on the run from police during the weeks my novel was set. I mean, I couldn't keep her out. So in the first draft, I called her something else, and I tried to keep her fictional and to not mention her politics too much. But my early readers, who are my agents and my editors, they were all like, tell us more about the doctor. You know? So I decided to let her have her full name. Because of course she's not as famous as she should be. And in Ireland, they're building a new children's hospital now, and there's been some talk of naming it after her. So I would love to add just a little more, you know, stone to her cairn, as it were, to have her be better known.
She's a completely fascinating character, and she lends such a gravitas to the story that I think puts Julia on the path to thinking about things more deeply. And you have an interesting scene when her brother brings her a cake, and she wonders if she's going to get the prize in the cake. And she takes a bite, and out of one bite she gets the thimble, signifying spinsterhood, and that the next bite she gets a ring, signifying that she's going to be married the next year. And how she noodles that all around and realizes that, you know, is it a toss up, or is it something that she can take charge of? That's a lovely scene too.
Well, I very deliberately had 3 main characters, because in a way, any book about just 2 people is very traditionally structured, you know. And I thought 3 would be more interesting, especially as I was trying to represent healthcare as the kind of web it is. I mean, no one person keeps you alive if you end up in hospital. You know, you need the cleaner, you need the person delivering the food, you need the orderlies, you need the specialists, you need the nurses. You need everyone. And so I was trying to suggest, with this sort of chain of, you know, from the doctor to the nurse down to a completely untrained volunteer helper, which is Bridie, they are all contributing to keeping you alive in that place. And I thought it would be interesting if they all affected each other in different ways. I mean, you've got Dr. Lynn kind of mentoring and, you know, spotting Julia's talent and feeding her interesting information and getting her to do autopsies with her and so on, really plucking her out of her kind of lowly role as a junior nurse. But then you have Julia transforming Bridie's life just by teaching her the basics of patient care, and by saying to her, you're good at this. You know, you may have no training and no education, but you have a knack with the patients. So one nice thing about by the way, setting a novel during a pandemic is you don't have to have people treating each other badly, because you need conflict for fiction, but there's already a built-in conflict in a situation where everybody's afraid the death is coming for them. Julia personifies that as, the bone man. The bone man is walking around the room. And when they're all afraid of the bone man, they don't have to be nasty to each other. So yes, there are some scuffles between, say, Julia and the night nurse, who's a nun. But mostly these people are actually very helpful to each other, and the women, the patients, are pretty kind to each other, and they try and give each other little moments of privacy in the middle of all this, birth and death. And so, it was actually quite refreshing to me to write a novel where the people could treat each other so nicely, because they all have this common enemy.
There is a real sense of decency in the book, and kindness among the patients as well. It's wonderful to see that we're all in it together, and they did feel a certain kinship. And the book, in many ways, is about the sisterhood, about women pulling for women. And it was really a pleasure to see, as you say, Dr. Lynn mentoring Julia, mentoring Bridie in turn, realizing that everybody was there to, especially in a hospital setting, help the patients and help people get better. And at one point, Julia says, it's not my job to cure these people. It's my job is to make them comfortable while they're here and ease their suffering. And I love that. I think that personifies everything that Julia is about. And how did the feeling between the three patients, even though there are moments of sadness that one of them has in particular, and sympathy for one that's going through a very, very long birth. How did you come to make the patients what they are? You've got patients from different backgrounds and different situations in pregnancy. How did you determine what was the personality and the background of the patients going to be?
Sure, good question. Yeah. I knew that, I think a key decision I made early on was that I would make it an inner city hospital serving mostly the slums, because I thought that would raise an interesting aspect of the sort of politics of healthcare. Your patients are not equal. They are not, equally healthy before the pandemic hits them. There's nothing random about a pandemic. And haven't we seen that so much this year? That health outcomes are so much to do with your postcode and your income and so on, rather than just the kind of randomness of the stars. So yeah, I knew that most of them would be poor, but I thought it would be a nice contrast if there was at least one very middle class one who's, she's meant to be in a nice nursing home, but their midwives have fallen ill, so she's found herself shunted into this one. And after that, I mostly thought in terms of different kind of births. I wanted to kind of capture birth in all its interesting variety, because birth is so little written about. Even if we see it in TV shows, for instance, it's usually so conventionalized. There'll be an absolutely huge belly, that looks like it could contain 4 babies. And then there'll be a splash moment and a pool of liquid. And that always means the birth is happening. And then you see one terrible scream and then a baby and everybody's looking pretty. In fact, birth is far more unpredictable and often longer than that. So I thought, okay, if I set the novel over 3 days, that'll give me a chance to show quite a few births. And I thought I want one that goes scarily long and tiring, one that goes way too fast, one that seems to go fine but a problem afterwards, one where the baby doesn't survive, one where the mother doesn't survive. I just tried to capture the variety of it, really. And I also wanted one where the woman wasn't married, because of course any novel about babies being born in Ireland into a culture which was all about getting married women to have as many babies as possible. I mean, I'm one of 8, and that's nothing. My grandfather was one of 21. So what? I thought, yeah, 21 by 2 mothers, But I thought it was crucial to sort of raise the issue of the Irish family. And if you didn't fit into the traditional family, if you were, for instance, an unmarried mother, you'd be really seen as quite a pariah figure. So this woman who's having a baby out of marriage, and she refuses to ever explain how it happened. She's been sent over from the mother and baby home just for this birth. And then she will have to work there 2 years in a kind of informal prison sentence to kind of work off her crime, as it were. And the baby will be kept in an orphanage, just like Bridie was. So I wanted to sort of show the whole, range of experiences you could have, from being in a traditional Irish family to being, one of the kind of shadow population of people who are locked up. Because, something I'm very aware of is how each country seems to have a scandal like this. I mean, in Canada, we have our residential schools and we think of them as a specifically racist, shameful episode in our history, as they are. But in Ireland, we did the same thing, but to our poor. There was no ethnic difference between the ones being, plucked off the streets and institutionalized, sometimes for life, in orphanages and residential schools. They were just, the poor, and therefore the scum of the earth, as they would have been seen. So basically, I was trying to show a social range and a medical range in terms of who the patients were. And I kept very elaborate notes, just like a nurse, like how each of the births was doing. Then, of course, each of them had a flu case as well, right? Some of them would have a hard birth but an easy flu, and vice versa. And every now and then I would consult my notes on what Julia was meant to be doing, and I'd be like, oh, she hasn't brought them to the toilet in 7 hours. They haven't eaten since morning. So I felt like a really perpetually harried nurse who was falling behind on my duties.
It's interesting what you say about Julia observing. Her eyes are opened by the different patients, and particularly by Bridie, when she learns about Bridie's background and how marginalized most of the people in the hospital, because it was in an inner city hospital in Dublin at the time. And her eyes are open to just how disenfranchised some of these people are and how marginalized. And Bridie talks to Julia about a baby that would go into the pipe, as she had done. Can you explain what that means for a child that would go into the pipe as soon as it were to be born?
I borrowed this phrase from, for my last novel, Akin. I read a lot about the foster care system in America, and came up against the concept of the school to prison pipeline, the kind of, the series of institutions through which the disenfranchised are passed, and how hard it is to escape from this kind of pipeline. So I thought, in Ireland, again, there was a network of institutions, from mother and baby homes through orphanages, where many of them would not technically be orphans, but they might have been plucked off the streets if they were, performing music in public or begging or something. Or if a mother died, the father might be told, oh, you can't raise girls, that's not decent, so we'll send them to the orphanage instead. And then there were sort of juvies, as it were, industrial schools or reformatories for troublesome teenagers. And then there were Magdalene hospitals, so-called, for fallen women or fallen girls. And then there were mother and baby homes if they got pregnant. So the whole thing represented a kind of a network of institutions that you could say that they were better than nothing. They technically fed and clothed these people and stopped them from dying in the street, but their abuses were legion. So Bridie is the only character I've ever written based on a government report. The Irish government recently did a huge investigation of abuses in these residential institutions, and it was called the Ryan Report. And I read every word of it to try and gather insight into what it might be to be somebody like Bridie, who has all these natural talents and even a natural gaiety and energy and curiosity, but she's had the worst kind of childhood. And she's, above all, never had any meaningful activity to do. I mean, she would have worked, say, bringing scraps to the pigs would be one of the tasks they'd have to do. But another was praying. They prayed on an industrial scale. Hungry children saying prayers, because the nuns had been paid for, certain 100 or 1,000 of prayers. So I thought it would be really interesting to take somebody like Bridie, and far from having her like complain of her miserable upbringing, to show her being thrilled at finding some meaningful work to do. Quite a few volunteers during the flu pandemic sounded exhilarated by how important the task was. So I thought it would be really interesting to show up in a poignant way the gap between Bridie's awful upbringing and how much she has to give, the kind of, her natural talents, which have never been used before.
So what happened really resulted in a huge fracturing of the family unit at the time. And I think that went on right through World War II, and we can find similarities in our residential schools as well. Do you have any thoughts about the effects of that years later and how that affected society? So many families separated, so many children separated from their both their parents or unwed parents, and as I said, we can make similarities with the Aboriginal schools as well. But what has resulted as a cause because of that?
Oh, that's a big question. What I would say is that Ireland has changed unrecognizably, just in my lifetime, even because when I was growing up, I mean, I found out in about the mid 90s that there'd been one of these, residential schools or they weren't called that, sorry, they're more like industrial schools or orphanages. There'd been one of them very near where I lived, so there were kids growing up in that awful punitive system very near, but I would never have known about them. And if they'd ever been mentioned, I would have thought like, oh, how nice of the nuns to take them in, So in a single generation, we've sort of unpeeled all that and asked all the hard questions about, how come so many babies died and ended up in mass graves, that kind of question. Or, how come so many women were sort of, bullied into handing over their kids when they left these mother and baby homes. And in some cases, then the nuns would financially benefit from arranging adoption of those kids, as we saw, say, in the film Philomena. So, I can't begin to speak to the long-term effects of these state policies. But what I would say is that Ireland has been doing a huge kind of exercise in, asking the questions that it never asked before and telling truths that always used to be covered up. So I would say just in my lifetime, Ireland has transformed from a place of sort of discretion and secrets and cover-ups to a place that is far more interested in telling the truth.
Well, I think we're all working towards that in Canada here as well. So you really have an interest in nursing and midwifery. And in the book, it's interesting because sometimes what Julia would like to do butts up against what the doctors of traditional medicine would like to do. And there's one section in the book where one of the patients is taking a long time to deliver her baby. She's very close, but it's just not coming. And the doctor would like to perform some very radical surgeries on this woman, but Julia is very reluctant because she knows that there would be long-lasting physical effects for this woman, and she tries one last procedure that is non-invasive with success. But can you talk about some of these radical surgeries that went on until not that long ago that doctors
Yes,
performed?
these surgeries, I don't want to repulse your audience, but it was basically an unhinging of the pelvis to just allow a little bit more room for a baby to come out. And it was called either a symphysiotomy or a pubiotomy. And they were really common in Ireland, I think from the 20s to about the 80s. And they're still performed occasionally in the developing world now, because if a woman is absolutely stuck, this operation can let mother and baby survive. And if you're absolutely desperate and if you're someone who doesn't have enough medical training to do a cesarean, this operation could be the least worst scenario. So anyway, they were done in Ireland all the time. And I only discovered them in my very last round of research. I was basically saying to myself, what would an Irish doctor do in 1918 if the baby seemed stuck? So I come across this appalling operation, which was done with a little hand-wound chainsaw. And I said to myself, I cannot include this operation in this book. There are limits to what I can cope with and to what my readers can cope with. But I want to be accurate, so often you're torn between the novelist and the historian. I'm thinking, okay, I can't just leave it out, but I can't bear to include it. So I thought I will raise the specter of this operation. I'll make it clear that this kind of thing happened all the time, and a lot of women were left with really disabling side effects from it. Even now, a lot of women in Ireland have been suing the government over this and saying that we were maltreated. I thought I'll raise it as a possibility, but then I will have Julia somehow manage to save the day I found this obscure position in a midwifery manual where a woman is like, her legs are dangling off a table, and this gives just another half inch of room for the baby to come out. So yes, I was always trying to sort of honor the sort of ingenuity of midwives and the way they have such a good tradition of kind of paying attention to the woman's mental state as well. I mean, a birth where you are not sort of supported and don't have people around you, it tends to go far worse, even in terms of just the normal process of birth, because you don't feel safe enough. So I really tried to get the kind of psychology as well as physiology of the midwifery thing right. I was really lucky. I had a midwife in Hamilton. She was being quarantined in March, and she was willing to read my book for me and give me tips. And she was rather horrified by how medical practices were in 1918. And I also had a copy editor for this book who is an emergency room doctor as well. So she was literally going between COVID wards and my novel. So I knew there was always a risk I would make bad medical mistakes, but I felt very reassured that I had these two women, you know, catching me if I fell, you know. Because you just can't, you know, be vague about the truth if you're talking about medical realities. You know, some of my previous novels, if I happened to get a fact wrong about 18th century dressmaking or whatever, you know, I would try not to, but the stakes are low. But if this is about medical realities and how people really died, you can't fudge it at all. So I've never been so anxious to get the details right as in this book.
Oh, well, it's interesting how intuitive midwifery is as well, and how they have such a wealth of knowledge that is well beyond the medical textbooks, and knowing what to do or trying things, understanding also the patient and what might work for them, or what the patient could bear at the time is just so important, especially at probably the most stressful point of women's lives, having a child, and especially if there's an emergency. So, Dr. Lynn says at one point, she talks to Julia and says, health and illness are political. And she talks about women paying the blood tax every day. Can you talk about that a little bit too?
Sure. This is an example of where it's always worth doing extra research. So I knew that, you know, the vote would be coming in and somebody might mention it. That's the month it got voted in, you know. So I thought, okay, to make it more interesting, I'll have somebody hostile mention it. So one of the orderlies is going to say to Julia, like, oh, you lot get the vote now. And I looked up what might some of his arguments against it have been. And I was quite surprised to come across this argument that really men earned their citizenship by being at least technically able to be conscripted for war if need be. Even if they didn't all individually go, the idea was every man might fight for his king and so has a right to his vote, whereas women aren't really in the political sphere at all. So anyway, they called this the blood tax, that men collectively paid the blood tax. And I thought, well, you know, given that it's women collectively who bring out the babies, you know, women pay the blood tax every day. So I decided if I place that argument literally in a birthing room, it makes it very concrete. As a novelist, you're always looking for ways to make things concrete. You know, for instance, all the stuff about, you know, the signs of the flu. I was always looking for highly sensory ways to mention those. So, for instance, early on, I came across the notion that some flu patients would get cyanosis, where they would, you know, get dark around the sort of tips of the ears and the lips and so on, and they would darken in color as their tissues were starved of oxygen. And I thought, oh, perfect! It's like a color-coded warning system. So I named the chapters of the book after those colors, because you really don't want it ever to feel as if what you've written is a summary or is a list of facts. You know, you're always trying to find ways to tie it to specific and vivid details.
The chapter headings were really interesting and reminded you of the trajectory of the illness as well. And also how serious things were getting throughout the book as women were coming closer and closer to labor. It was really interesting. So the last question I'd like to ask you before we open the questions up to the participants is, how has the book been received in Ireland?
Well, actually, it's up for Best Irish Novel. The ceremony's on tomorrow, and as with all prize ceremonies this year, I'll take part in it by Zoom, which is not quite the same fun. I've been to that ceremony before twice, and it's such a fun party usually. I remember our daughter falling asleep on the table. She wasn't drunk, she was about 8. But I remember it was a very festive occasion. So basically the book has been very warmly received in Ireland. Yeah. So it's lovely to feel appreciated by my home country in that sense, as well as my home country here in the other sense. I would say probably my biggest sales are in America just because it's the biggest audience, but I tend to get particularly loyal responses from readers in Canada and Ireland, and I tend to show up more on bestseller lists there. So it's lovely having 2 countries that that claim me as their own.
Well, congratulations on being nominated. Fingers crossed for tomorrow. We'll look forward to hearing. Now, some questions from the participants. So one person asks, will there be a sequel to The Pull of the Stars? And a second part of that is, what are you working on next?
I have no plans for a sequel. The only time I've ever consciously written a sequel is I have a kids' book set in Toronto about a family called the Lotteries, and I planned that as a series, and I've done 2 of them so far because kids love a series, you know. But mostly when I'm finished a book, that's as long as I want to spend in that world. But I love adaptation, so there's talk already about a film of The Pull of the Stars, and I would really enjoy that. That would give me a great chance to kind of look at the whole thing again, but telling it differently. My next film would probably be the film of my 2016 novel, The Wonder, and I really enjoyed making the film of Room. So in a way, to me, a film adaptation is like a sequel in that I get to kind of revisit that world, doing something very different. I'm afraid writing sequels often to me would just feel like more of the same, you know, but I realize that's a bit of a rebuff to many readers who engage with the characters so passionately. They would love to hear more. I suppose I like to leave the characters with you so that you can imagine your own future for them. You know, I like to provide enough hints of 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 what lies in the characters that they could bring to their future. For instance, in the book, I would say Tim, Julia's brother, he never meets Barnabas, but perhaps you can deduce from the way Tim has behaved so far how he will respond. You know.
Yes.
You also asked what I'm working on now. I'm trying to write a musical, would you believe? I was so crushed when theatres shut down. The play of Room was about to open here in London, Ontario, and then it was
Yes,
about to
that
move
was
on to
such a great.
Toronto. And it was all cancelled on its opening night on the 13th of March, you know, so my COVID started with a bang, as it were. So to me, it's really crucial to be working on something theatrical and specifically a musical. You know, I'm collaborating with a composer, and just it's kind of a promise to ourselves that someday there'll be big noisy shows on for big audiences, and you know, theater will rise again.
It must be a fun challenge working something in your head that you would normally have written into a film version or a stage play. I mean, you've got to adapt it to the medium as it is. It must be fun to do that, a whole different way of looking at your written material.
It is fun. I mean, some people talk about it in very sort of defensive terms, like, you know, what percentage can you keep in? But it's not like that. You know, we've all seen film adaptations where every scene is out of the book, and yet somehow none of the magic has been captured. So, you know, the film of Room, for instance, it's not word for word what the book is at all. We changed many things, but we changed them all in the spirit of capturing the feel of what it is to be in Jack's mind. And I think you should always sort of play to the strengths of the medium. In, you know, what film is really good at is, for instance, faces, and light and looking, and you seeing people looking and seeing what they see. So for instance, you know, it's easier to hide things in words. So in the book of Room, at the start, you don't quite know what's going on. So I use that confusion for quite a long time. But in the film, you know, the camera turns around once and you can see exactly where the room is and that the door is locked. So there's no point having that mystery. So we just skip that whole section. So, you know, film moves faster in some ways and does a lot less spelling things out with words as well. Whereas books, one thing that's wonderful about books is that they include a lot of words, a lot of time, a lot of time for little tonal shifts, for instance. Films are far more streamlined and ruthless, you know.
So interesting. And the last question is, what are you reading now?
Let me see. I've just finished a gigantic biography of Edison because we went for a one-night getaway to Edison's in Stratford, which is the building he lodged in as a teenager. So I was so fascinated by that. I thought, oh, I must immediately buy a biography of him. So I try and read quite broadly. For my birthday, my partner gave me several books about, like, you know, the rise of right-wing populism in America and the death of democracy. I'm too scared to read them until Biden's actually in the White House. I'm going to read them in late January. Right now, it's all too scary.
Yeah, it is.
And
Yeah.
yeah, I've been reading a few good novels. A novel called American Wife about Laura Bush by Curtis Sittenfeld.
Yes.
What else have I read recently? There's one I loved last year called Such a Fun Age by Kylie Reid. Yeah, about a woman working as a nanny. So smart. So yeah, you know, like most of you, I don't think I could get through this long winter ahead without a stack of books by my side.
Well, one of the shining lights in the pandemic is that we have more time to read, and that is such a bonus. I think we have to sign off now. And Emma, I want to say that you have written a book of great tenderness, connection, love, and most importantly, hope for humanity. Thank you for bringing this pull of the stars into the world. And I would like to close my conversation with paraphrasing one of my favorite line in the book, which is that unless you're dead, you are 100% alive.
Here's to that. Here's to that.
On behalf of the Muskoka Libraries, our many readers and fans who have participated today, and myself, thank you, Emma and HarperCollins. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you about the book and hear your thoughts, and about your thoughts on the world as well. So thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you with your next book.
It's been a treat. Thank you all. Sorry we didn't answer all the questions.
That's okay.
A great response.
We'll get to them with your next book, and best wishes for you and your family to stay well. Thanks again very much. Over to you, Julia.
So I have to say that we've had almost 200 people attending this event. Emma, just so you are aware,
wow.
Listening in on it. Great responses, amazing chat conversations. There were some great questions there. And I just want to do a few thank yous. Thank you, of course, to Emma for connecting with people via history that's attainable and real. I think that's something that people really is insightful and appeals to people, especially right now. What you've written is highly applicable, of course, especially your comments around healthcare. I have to say myself that I really, that your details and like people have to be understanding of that, especially of the history of healthcare. And I think people will understand just how complex it is because of what you've said tonight. You've been insightful, of course, you're generous, and we really appreciate your willingness to participate in tonight's event. Thank you. Thank you, Nina, as well, for moderating and for preparing some very thought-provoking questions, and also for taking some great questions from the audience. Really appreciate that. It provided some great conversation and some listening from what Emma had to say. I want to thank Lauren Morocco from HarperCollins for her arrangement of this event. I also want to thank Sarah McNeil from the Bracebridge Public Library for all the work she did to support the technology to make this event a virtual event. Fantastic. And a big thanks to the audience for watching our first collaborative virtual event, author event with with Emma Donoghue. And just a couple of housekeeping events before we close off. The Pull of the Stars, which Emma has been talking about tonight, is available at all Muskoka Libraries for rent, of course, or for checking out. But if you want to support your local bookseller by purchasing a copy of the book, which would be fantastic, you can go through bookstorefinder.ca, bookstorefinder.ca, to find your closest independent bookstore. I think most of us up here in Muskoka know where our bookstores are, but please check it out and purchase a copy through them. Some stores may be carrying some signed copies, and you can inquire as to whether your local bookstore does do that or has any in stock. Okay. Or you can also send your local library in Muskoka a proof of your purchase by email. We will happily supply a sticker with Emma's signature so that you can place that in the book, such as COVID, right? Usually Emma would sign these books herself in person, as we know. I'm sure she's done a lot of that. But because of COVID, we are doing that virtually, and we can send those out to you if you have purchased a book through your bookseller. And we highly encourage you to support Emma in that. So thank you so much. That about wraps it up for the evening. Emma, some highly inspiring discussion. I think everybody really appreciated it. I can't say enough about that. So, and thank you for your research, all the work you've done on your novel from a librarian.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks all.
Good night.
See you next time.
Good
Yes.
night. Stay well.
Stay well.